So it's great to see so many faces on the screens. I don't know how many were able to participate last night in the wonderful revival that we had, and the great sermon from a presiding bishop. Welcome to you, presiding bishop. You're right in the middle of my screen. I don't know whether that's protocol or what, but you're absolutely middle square, right in the middle of my first page. So, we're starting in about a couple of minutes. I'll let some other people join us, and then we'll begin this morning's session. So, all right. Meg, are we ready to launch in?
We are.
All right. Well, first of all, let's give an incredible thanks to Meg for the amazing production that she did to make last night possible. It was a revival design team that included Meg and Julianne, and then Elizabeth Popplewell and Kathleen Milligan, Lizzie Gilman, Deb Cutler, Susan Forche, Kevin Goodrich, and Vivian Roberts. They were all part of our revival team. And it was just a remarkable evening, and such complementation from our companion dioceses, some of whom are on this call today. The choirs from Dundee and the testimony. And then at the very last moment, we got the choir, or the youth choir from All Saints in Zara. And they were the ones that had you all dancing out at the end of the service in the postlude. I mean, and they came in right under the wire. So God has been good to us in what we've sought to do to glorify God's name. And I think that will be the same situation today. I do just want to follow some introductory notes, just to let you keep things aware. During this time, my dear wife Donna will be interpreting. I'm trying to consider what room she's in right now for doing this, but I can't quite make it out. But she'll be doing sign language interpreting, and there'll be other interpreters too. Robin and Alejandro will be interpreting in Spanish, and I think we have a Dinka interpreter as well for today's conversation. There is at the bottom of your screen an interpretation or translation sort of button. I've got mine on English, so if you want a Spanish or a Dinka interpretation, you'll have to hit that button, and it will come up, and then you click the symbol, and the language you'll get concurrent translation. There's also the prayer line that was open last night, is open now from until noon, with chaplains ready to listen and pray, also in English, Spanish, Dinka, and Arabic. And Meg will put the number in the chat. It's 202-998-3510. So we have 3 conversations today with the presiding bishop on loving, liberating, and life-giving. What I call the presiding bishop, I call this your 3L God. Your 3L God, your loving, liberating, and life-giving God as you proclaim God. And so we'll have opportunity to lift up questions using the chat. So if you have questions that come to your mind during listening to the responses, and you want to add to the conversation, you can add those in the chat feature in the Zoom toolbar. And we'll try to get as many as we can in. We're aiming for about an hour and a half, but we'll make us go over a little bit. So let's begin in prayer. I find myself being drawn constantly nowadays to this famous prayer that we use at ordinations and other events particularly, but it's well known to all of you probably by now, but it captures, I think, where we feel we are in our day and age. So let us pray. O God of unchangeable power and eternal light, look favorably on your whole church, that wonderful and sacred mystery. And by the effectual working of your providence, carry out in tranquility the plan of salvation, Let the whole world see and know that things which were cast down are being raised up, and things which are grown old are being made new, and that all things are being brought to their perfection by him through whom all things were made, your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. So let's open up our conversation. We want to take the subject of our loving God, and to guide us in that, we have, first of all, some testimony that will come from Tom Early, and then I will introduce our moderators. So handing over to Tom.
There was a time in my life when I was called to visit a monastery. At the time, I couldn't tell you why, but now I think it's safe to say that God had something to do with it. I remember showing up, driving north from Boston on a bus, getting dropped off at the bus terminal, and having a brother come pick me up. He was so generous in his welcoming of me to his life of prayer. But once we got to the monastery, he didn't talk to me anymore. In fact, nobody talked to me anymore. The monks and their guests practiced this habit of holy silence. Now, for me, that was very challenging because I like to be liked. I work really hard at getting people to like me. And when I showed up at the monastery, I couldn't do that. These people were quiet all the time. They were quiet when we woke up. They were quiet in the hallway. The only time that we really talked was when we were praying. And then we were really just talking to God. We even talked, or we even were silent when we ate. I remember I sometimes wish there was some music because there was a monk who would slurp his soup particularly loud. It drove me crazy that first time I visited the monastery because I just wanted people there to like me. I left there very frustrated, but I still felt called to return. And the second time I went, I kind of felt a little bit more comfortable with the silence. And eventually I settled into it. I read some Bible. And finally was quiet enough to listen to God. In the silence, I heard God's love for me more profoundly, more palpably than I ever have before. It just washed over me. It possessed me in ways that I had never experienced before. Later that day at lunch, I recall eating some gazpacho or something like that and just starting to weep at the table. And nobody, I did it quietly, I guess, enough for nobody to notice. But I just remember being so keenly aware of God's love for me that I was slurping my soup and being caught up in God's love and crying a little bit. I think what the monks knew that I didn't, especially on that first trip, was the approval that I sought, they could never fully satisfy. But if they left me alone, they left me in silence, perhaps I'd have a chance to know of something better than approval. I'd have a chance to know God's love. And I did.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to hand us over now, or hand the presiding bishop over to a couple of our high schoolers. I think they're near the end of that time, maybe transitioning out. But anyway, two leaders among our youth, Charles Jeton and Greta Berner. And they are your first moderators for a section on what it is that what you mean by, well, they'll ask the questions about your concept of the loving God. So Greta and Charles, have at it with the presiding bishop.
Hello, thank you, Presiding Bishop, for joining us today.
Thank you.
We're glad to have you.
It's good to be with you.
Thank you. You want to start?
Yeah. My first question is, how do you respond to someone who is being clear about their doubts in God?
Oh, okay. Thank you. Well, look, both Greta and Charles, thank you for doing this. And Bishop Allen, he's up at the top. You're at the top of the screen now. Bishop Allen, and to Meg and all the team and everybody who's made this revival time possible, and everybody who's been praying over this, and to just everyone in the Diocese of Iowa. Thank you for letting me be a little part of what God is doing in your midst and in the midst of our world. So thank you all. You know, I have to admit that I'm probably not being exactly accurate to say that the older I get, the less I say. My wife would dispute that. She said, no, you seem to be preaching longer and longer. But I do know that I say less in conversations with others, whether it's one-on-one, partially because I'm learning to listen, and partially because I've come to realize that when someone has doubts and about God, that's where they are at that moment, and it's important just to be with them where they are. And I don't offer answers unless asked a question, and actually let them walk. I'm learning it's more important to walk the journey with someone than to talk the journey with them. And that way, that allows the conversation that eventually does happen sometimes to happen authentically and in a way that I think the Spirit can work with. I'm less uncomfortable with, I believe it was Tom who just gave a testimony. I'm less uncomfortable with the silence than I was when I was a young priest, to be sure. Because I'm learning God can fill those silences in a way that my words very often can't. There's a time for the words, and walking with someone on their journey, that time will come, and then you speak, and then you talk. My experience is that one person's journey shared with another person's journey is more effective than any academic answers I've ever been able to come up with. You know, doubt is real. It's part of the journey. You know, faith means doubt can be a part of it, because faith is not proof. Faith is trust in spite of. That. Now let me switch to an academic thing, but this has been with me since I was young. I mean, well, a young priest. Paul Tillich, who was a theologian back in the 50s, I guess 40s, 50s, 60s, wrote a book that called The Courage to Be, that every once in a while I pick up and read again. And in that book, he said, he was talking about courage, and he, went back to the Greeks and Romans and the notion of courage for life and for living. And he really was talking about sometimes it just takes courage to really live an authentic and genuine life. And, you know, when you think about it, it actually does. It takes courage to stand up for what you believe and trust is right when that may not be popular. And courage to love people you disagree with, and to be humble enough to say, well, I've got my position, but they could be right. Anyway, Tillich was talking about the various ways of courage, forms of courage, both in ancient. And he basically said courage is not being unafraid. Courage is always in spite of your fear, always in spite of your anxiety. And at one point he said, faith is the courage to trust God in spite of your doubts about God. He said, faith is the courage to affirm love in spite of the power of hatred. Courage is the courage to stand for the good in spite of the power of evil. Courage, but some time ago when I was a bishop in North Carolina, and we were going through a tough time, and Bishop Scarf may remember some of these days when I had given consent to Bishop Robinson's consecration and allowed blessings in the Diocese of North Carolina. I was not, my poll numbers had gone down dramatically. And I wasn't as popular, and everyone didn't agree. And, you know, I had to learn to honor and respect those who disagreed because they could be right. I mean, who knows? None of us are God, but you sort of have to stand for what you stand for, and yet kneel and respect before others who have a different way of understanding. Anyway, my canon to the ordinary, who was probably, I don't know who the canon to the ordinary is. I don't know if it's Meg or who it is there, but that's sort of the bishop's right-hand person, that your go-to person. Well, my canon to the ordinary was a priest named Marie Fleischer, and Marie found one of these little things that you put on your refrigerator, and you know, magnetic things, and it had a picture of John Wayne, of all people. Anyway, it had a picture of John Wayne on it, and in it, it had inscribed, "Courage is being scared to death and getting up on the horse anyway." That's courage. That's faith. Doubting, not knowing the answers, but saying, doggone it, I'll trust you. I'll keep giving you a shot, God. That's courage. And eventually, that's faith.
Thank you. Another question that we have is, how have you experienced God's love in your time as a bishop?
As a bishop?
Yes.
Well, you know, in ways that I wouldn't have expected, to be honest. In a lot of ways, one of the things I'm aware of is being, and Bishop Allen can tell you, you may have no idea what it means to you're actually being prayed for. I mean, that you actually are being prayed for. I mean, it's, you know, sometimes people say, I'll keep you in my thoughts and prayers, and there's a part of me wants to say, don't keep me in your thoughts and prayers, because I'm not sure what that really means. Tell me you're going to pray for me. I get that. But to know that people, you know, it's in the prayer book, so you sort of have to pray for us periodically in the prayers of the people. But to actually know that that's that, I got to tell you, that has made, there are times when I've been conscious of that making a difference and actually mattering for me in a conscious kind of way. Other times you're not aware of it, but a lot of times you are. There's one time in particular, but there've been a couple. One time in particular when I was very aware of God's love being activated in my life when I couldn't, and I knew people were praying that love to be active in my life when I couldn't. I was elected a presiding bishop in June. It was June, the end of June in 2015 at our general convention. And then the presiding bishop actually takes office November 1st on All Saints Day. I mean, by canon, that's required. So that's the day you actually become the presiding bishop. And so usually you have a service that day or somewhere there nearabouts. So on the day of my installation as presiding bishop, early that morning, I had gone out for a walk and was going to meet some of our staff from North Carolina at a Starbucks. So I ran across the street to the Starbucks where they were, got across the street and tripped over the curb and fell, and I just fell and didn't pay any attention to it. Well, it turns out I hit my head, but I knew it, but it didn't hurt. So I didn't pay any attention to it. Well, everything went along fine, went through the service and went through everything the next day, and the next couple of weeks went along fine. And then I guess it was about a month later, I had been in the Diocese of Los Angeles, and I remember having this head sensation. I thought I had a head cold. It wasn't quite a headache. It was just a very strange sensation in a head. Anyway, flew from LA to I don't remember where, but I remember I went to Bruton Parish Church in Williamsburg to preach. And while I was preaching, I got completely disoriented. And I couldn't figure out, I was having trouble remembering the sermon, having trouble putting words together. And I literally looked down at the iPad, which I only do in terms of notes or to read a quote. And I've had a poem at the end of the sermon, and I just read the poem to finish the sermon and get out of the pulpit. And for the rest of the service, I didn't know what was going on. Long and short of it, when I had hit my head weeks before, it started a slow bleed, a subdural hematoma. And subdural hematomas don't show up for a couple of weeks because they're slow bleeds. They're not like a stroke where you may know it right away. They're just very slow. So I didn't even know it. Next thing I knew, I was in Richmond, eventually in surgery and all of that, and have recovered. But when I came out of the hospital, I had to go in rehab for physical, occupational, and speech therapy. I couldn't walk unassisted. I couldn't sign my name. I could speak, but I couldn't tell if the words that were coming out of my mouth were consistent with what I was thinking in my head. There were all sorts of things. I had a lot of, not as serious as a stroke, but a lot of the symptoms in the experience. Again, with subdurals, you heal, you can heal pretty much from it, and I have. Well, within a month, I had to go to a meeting of the primates of the Anglican Communion, which are all the archbishops, presiding bishops, and moderators of the various churches around the world, Asia, Africa, Great Britain, the Americas, Pacific Rim. And I had to be at that meeting because many were upset with us in the Episcopal Church because we had changed our marriage canon to make it possible for all consenting adults, whether gay or straight, to be married in the church. Now, we believe that we hadn't changed the doctrine of marriage. We've opened up marriage to those who may participate in the sacrament. That didn't change what the sacrament was. It expanded who could participate in it. They didn't agree with us. Many didn't agree with us. It was a meeting where there was question as to whether or not the Anglican Communion would actually be able to hold together as one communion, one church. It was a tense meeting. It was a week-long meeting, and there I was, still in rehab. I couldn't even walk through Heathrow Airport by myself. Members of my staff had to walk with me because I couldn't do all of the mental cognitive functions, reading a sign, making a decision, turning left, all of the things we take for granted. I couldn't do all of them. And there I was, the only American representing you, the Episcopal Church, all by myself. Now, I wasn't by myself completely because the Archbishop of Canada was just next door, and the Archbishop from Canada was sitting right next to me. And Scotland, who's our mother church, the Primus from Scotland was sitting on the other side. And there were a number of others who were of support. But I had to, at some point, speak and address the body and that kind of stuff. I say all of that to say I was able to do that only because people were praying and the love of God was being poured out on me to help me do what I didn't have the power or the strength or the energy on my own to do. I know that now as clearly. There was no question in my mind. It was nothing, as St. Paul talks about, the love of God has been poured out on us. And I felt it that week and knew it that week because I didn't have the strength to do it. There's more, but I'd be talking too long. But that's, that's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, so my next question is, how do you define the way of love in everyday modern life?
Wow. Well, I had it's interesting that the way of love sometimes has gotten lost in public perceptions of what Christian faith and Christianity is about, because it was at the core of Jesus. I mean, it was at the core. It was at the heart and soul. And and if you look at Jesus, how Jesus, when he talks about love and when he exhibits it, just in the way he treats other people, the way he actually, his manner of life, the way he actually lives his life, you're actually getting a picture of what the love of God looks like in the person of Jesus. So that the way Jesus interacts with people in the gospel stories, that's what the love of God looks like. As well as when Jesus talks about love explicitly. So give you a couple quick examples, and it applies in any age in which you live. For example, one place he talks about love is a story most folk in church know. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan, where it's in Luke 10, where guys beaten up on the side of the road. A couple of people pass by and they, don't bother. And finally, this one guy comes and helps the person out, and takes care of all their needs and does everything and makes sure that they get medical care and that they get what they need so they'll be okay. And as the story is told, the guy who's beaten up on the side of the road was actually helped by somebody who was virtually his enemy. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan. Samaritans and Jewish folk in those days didn't particularly get along. And yet this Samaritan helped this Jewish guy out. He didn't not help him because he was Jewish. He helped him because he was a human being. He's a child of God, his brother, his sister, his sibling. He just did that. Now, everybody knows the parable. What often is forgotten is that the parable was told in a conversation between Jesus and a lawyer talking about love. The lawyer asked Jesus, he says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Which is like, asking somebody, what can I do to have a better life or to live a life that makes sense? And Jesus said, well, what did Moses say? And the lawyer says, well, he said, you shall love the Lord your God and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, bingo. He didn't actually say bingo, but that's what he meant. He said, bingo, love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. That's the key. And Jesus actually says, do that and you will live. Do that and you'll find life. Do love and you will find the secret of life. It doesn't mean it will be easy, but you'll do it. And love God, love your neighbor. And the lawyer says, well, but who's my neighbor? And that's when Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's what does love look like? The way of love look like in our lives? It looks like a life of unselfish, even sacrificial sometimes, care and service for others as well as the self. A commitment to make a difference for each other as well as myself, and not just my family or not just people of my political party or or not just my nation or my religion, but it's actually willing to live for others as well as for yourself. And when you bless others, you get blessed too. And that's the nature of, that's the heart and soul of love for Jesus. I mean, there's a Um, everybody knows John 3:16. It used to be at football games. God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And Episcopalians know it because it's the comfortable words in Rite One, in Rite One liturgy. God so loved the world that he gave. Look at the word. God so loved the world that he gave. He didn't take. It wasn't about him. It was about us, about the world. That's what the love of God looks like. That's what you see in Jesus, who goes to the cross not for himself, not so he could be famous, not so he could be, enshrined in crucifixes on above church altars. That's not why he died. He died because he cared about us. He died for the good and the well-being of others, to show us the way that sacrifice, that living for others as well as the self, is the way to life for us all. That's the way of love. And that, Charles and Greta, I'm telling you, that is the key to our democracy. I think I talked about Cicero in the revival sermon the other night. I just love that. I never thought I'd be enjoying Cicero, but when I was in school and could actually read it, I wasn't paying attention. But now I'm 68 and I'm paying attention finally. But Cicero was right. When someone loves another and cares about them as much, and if not more, as they care about themselves, then e pluribus unum, which is the motto of the United States, then one from many becomes possible. Then human society becomes possible. Then a global community becomes possible. Then saving a world so that the climate doesn't implode on us for generations yet to come becomes possible. That way of love is God's way of life, which is why Jesus said, do that and you'll find life. That's probably more than you asked for, but anyway.
I think we have time for one more quick question. And we're wondering, how do you love someone who is causing like so much hurt in the world?
Wow. Well, one, it's not easy. But two, there is a it's in Romans 12, Paul's letter to the Romans in chapter 12, where Paul actually is talking about love. It's sort of in the second half of the chapter, but he's actually talking about love, and you can tell it's like he's riffing. How jazz artists will take a basic theme and then they'll riff off of it and kind of do that. It's like Paul is riffing off of Jesus's teachings in the Sermon on the Mount, where he said, "Love your enemies, bless those who curse you." And about midway through chapter 12, Paul starts this riff. He says, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, and that kind of thing, which is what you're asking about. And Paul, talks about it, and you can see him. It really is like a jazz riff. He's like building to something, and the verses keep going and keep going. And when you get to the end of chapter 12, he finally says, "This is what it looks like to love your enemies." He says, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." To love even your enemy, so to speak, or someone who is a personification of evil in what they're doing in the world. It's one, not to hate them as a person, but two, and equally and maybe even more importantly, to do everything you can to do the good. To do the good in the world around them. So it may mean that you don't let them continue to do their evil. You try to counter the evil, but not with more evil, but with good. That was the Mahatma Gandhi, and obviously others before him, in fact, but just Gandhi realized that's what Jesus was talking about when he talked about loving your enemies, going the second mile, turning the other cheek. He was saying, don't take up Don't use methods of evil to stop evil. Use methods of good to counter evil. And so that's where you get nonviolent resistance. Instead of violent resistance, there's got to be a nonviolent way to counter the evil. You don't let the evil continue, but you find ways to change whatever is hurtful and harming people that are good and that are loving, but that actually do the change, and maybe sometimes change the hearts of people who have been perpetuating the evil. I've only met John Lewis, or was in his presence twice. Once actually in his office, but and another time when he was speaking. And I don't remember if he told this. Actually, he did. It's also in one of his books, that when he was on the Freedom Rides, when mixed groups, integrated groups of Black and white young people, they were all young people. They weren't people my age. They were young people. Would ride on buses and cross state borders, deliberately going across interstate borders, to demonstrate that there must be no segregation or separation of races across interstate borders and in other places around the country. They would deliberately go south and deliberately be mixed, and it would be stopped eventually. Anyway, they were going, I believe, through North Carolina, heading into South Carolina. I'm in North Carolina now, probably just south of Charlotte, into Sharon, North Carolina, Sharon and York, South Carolina. Anyway, they had to stop to refuel the bus. They got out to, get snacks, go to the bathroom, and that kind of stuff. And they were beaten up. And John Lewis was beaten up. Anyway, long story short, years later, John Lewis was in Congress, and a white man, an older guy, wanted to have an appointment. And it turned out he was one of the people who had, whether he had beaten John Lewis himself, had been in the mob that was beating up the Freedom Riders. And he came and the two of them met. And he asked for John Lewis's forgiveness. That story, if I remember correctly, is in a chapter where Lewis is talking about love. He said love was to be a freedom rider. It was to work to change an unjust and evil system. But love was also to hold out the possibility that some people who may have perpetuated that evil were still people, and that they needed to be loved too. And every once in a while, some of their hearts will be touched and they will be changed. And that's love. That's what the love of God looks like. And that's how you love your enemies.
Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Oh, thank you all. Those were hard questions. If I was in an examination for school, those were tough questions and important ones. Thank you both. Thank you very much. Wow.
So you have to get through the young people in Iowa if you're going to get.
That's right.
Into some place of being trusted, I think.
Yeah.
They know what's that. Bringing up John Lewis and an example from the racial conflicts and so on within our society, of course, raises the question of when you shift to beginning to talk about God as a liberating God, that, to shift our hearts and minds to think particularly about race relations and reconciliation, repair, healing, truth-telling within our society. And that has become a very important part of what you present to us. And so we're going to have a testimony right now about what liberating means to Meg, who is the founder, or one of the co-founders of Iowa's Beloved Community Initiative. and then we'll hand you over to Kim Turner-Baker, who is the chair of our task force on reparations, and she will moderate the next section of conversation. So to Meg.
Growing up, I understood liberation as an important theme in the Bible. From the people of Israel being led out of slavery into freedom, to Jesus' resistance to the Roman occupation, and to Paul's assertion in Galatians that Christians are divided not into Jew or Greek, slave or free, that we're all one in Christ Jesus. I grew up in an almost exclusively white suburb near Chicago, with no real understanding of how that had come to be. I remember when Stephen Biko was killed in South Africa. My mom tried to explain apartheid to me, but it was clear the message I was supposed to be getting was that that was another side of the world problem. That here in America, we'd had our civil rights battles, and we're safely on the other side of them. Here, we treated each other based entirely on our character, not our skin color, and everyone has the same opportunities regardless of the color of their skin. It wouldn't be until adulthood, until I started to become free from that narrative and began to make more sense out of the inequity I saw around me. I sometimes describe it to people as an ongoing process of veils lifting and beginning to see more clearly. From understanding who had been the original occupants of the land I'm on right now and how they were forced to leave, to the policies and practices that have inscribed apartness and racial oppression that we experience in this country. I know now it will be lifelong work, discovering the history I was never taught, building relationships with people of color that our apartness denied me, pulling apart the threads of racism that I internalized without even recognizing it, and wrestling with the way that Christians have at times provided the software that made the hardware of oppression work. But this work feels like liberation every day to me. Although that's not to say it always feels good, it feels uncomfortable a lot of the time. One of the things that strikes me as so dangerous about all these divisive concept bills around the U.S., including the one that passed here in Iowa, is this notion that we should all be free from ever feeling uncomfortable about the past or take any personal responsibility for it. One of the things we say in our dismantling racism training is, can something not be our fault, yet still be our responsibility? How are we able to respond differently as we understand more? I believe that's the work of liberation. It's freeing me from feeling helpless or stuck in guilt in the face of the racial injustices I see in the country. And it's empowering me to be a part of change here in Iowa. It's freeing me from the ignorance about our history that the system of white supremacy demands in order for it to hold together at all. It's freeing me to see the structures of racism and inequity more clearly around me and to find partners that can envision new ways of being. Our diocese decided at its fall convention to enter in a season of truth and healing altogether, where we discover and share our congregations and state history with race and begin to talk about what the work of repair might look like here in Iowa. We'll be digitally mapping and sharing the histories of Iowa's and our church's part in benefiting from the legacies of slavery and indigenous genocide and displacement, as well as mapping our own civil rights milestones we're proud of here in Iowa and that we want to build on, and the millstones from our history that are still holding us back. I expect we'll have some hard conversations in the years ahead, within our churches and in our communities as we continue this work. But I truly believe it is work that will help liberate us all.
All right, so Kim, I'm going to hand over to you for the next half hour or so, or however long these segments are. I think they're about 25 minutes. So.
The first problem with this is this topic really needs about 15 years, not 15 minutes. pages of things that I would love to ask and talk about.
It's good to see you, Kim.
um, so, as I said, it would take a much longer time. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
It would take a much longer time than we have to really flesh out all of the things that I would like to. But one of the things I'm aware of is that the Episcopal Church has long struggled with the problem of race, and in some ways was a little late in getting into the, the struggle. It was in 1964 that it finally said that there should not be any discrimination in the Episcopal Church. And it seems that at least about every 5 years, we have to have another resolution that says the same thing over and over and over again. And there has, first of all, I would like to hear what you think about the trajectory that we've been on in the last 50 years, and where talk a little bit about where we've been and where we're going, and then I have some other questions from there.
Where we as the church, as the Episcopal Church, you know, we're talking about the church we love. I love this church. Wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I didn't. And I think work of truth and reconciliation, listening to truths, painful truths of our past, but not just listening, not for the point of wallowing in it, not for anybody to get beat. This is not about guilt. This is not about getting anybody pointing any fingers or anybody getting beaten up. This is about learning from the past, listening to the truths of the past, learning from them together, and then, as we say in the way of love disciplines, to turn. That's what it actually means to repent, to acknowledge what I've done wrong, to learn from it, not to wallow in it, and then to turn in the direction of the rising sun, in the SON now, talking about in the direction of God, and then to turn, and in the old pattern of repentance and forgiveness and all of that, there must be amendment of life. I have to do something that, even though I can't change the past, I can redeem it by changing the future, having learned from it by changing the future. And that's the Christian trajectory of forgiveness and salvation, and to turn and you build a new future for us, the beloved community, to work. So the whole point of truth and reconciliation is find ways. How do we get out of this mess? How do we get off the treadmill, or the hamster's wheel? How do we get off of it? Well, you get off of it by facing it, learning from it, turning, and then working together, all of us working together to build and construct a new future that has learned from the past. I believe that's true. America has to do that. The United States of America, we have to do it. We're not ready as a nation. I know that. But that's okay. We have to keep saying it, because we will only be freed from enslavement to the past. It's like therapy. When you name it, you start getting some power over it. But as long as it's unnamed, it has power over you in ways you don't even know sometimes. So I believe that that's true for America. I think it's true for us as an Episcopal Church, true for Diocese of Iowa, for all of us, that's the work that has to be done. We in our church, look, not just our church, but the Christian church has sinned. And it has sinned grievously. It has justified the genocide of indigenous peoples around the world. I mean, the doctrine of discovery, there were papal bulls, and there were acts of parliament and the Church of England. Don't worry, this was an ecumenical injustice. We participated in it. The Calvinists participated in it. This was thoroughly ecumenical. I mean, the Dutch Reformed theology in South South Africa, that was Protestant. It was the Anglican tradition, the Bishop of London, not the current Bishop of London, but her predecessors of London, that justified the enslavement of Africans and allowed them to be baptized because they twisted. Even St. Paul had said, all who have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is therefore no more slave or free. Oops. And it was the Bishop of London who said, oh, Paul didn't mean that in terms of civil law. He meant that in terms of spiritual. That's nonsense. That's not what Paul meant. Paul meant exactly what he said. That was a deliberate distortion of the scriptures. So anyway, that's to say that we in our tradition have participated in evils. We have. Like we have paralleled our society. Every once in a while, there were voices of prophecy who would speak a word that was contrary to both society and church, but they were usually minority voices. But they were there, thank God. And so the Episcopal Church, you know, I'm here in North Carolina, and I was blessed to be bishop here for 15 years. My family hails from here on my mother's side. My father's Boker, Alabama, but my mother's people are all here, or hail from here. And they were slaves here. That's part of our heritage. I was a relatively new bishop and was at Christ Church, Raleigh, which is right off Capitol Square, and was given communion at one of the services. I think it was the middle 9 o'clock service. Anyway, people had name tags, and I was given communion and came across a family, husband, wife, and 2 boys. And the last name was Strayhorn. Well, I looked at the name on the name tag, and I said, "Your last name Strayhorn?" And Billy said, he said, "Yeah." I said, "We got to talk after service because my mother's people are all Strayhorns." Anyway, so we gave communion. So I finished the body of Christ and continued communion. And then after the service, we talked. You know, we were never able to nail it down completely, but their family of the Strayhorns settled in Orange County and in Hereford County here. My folk hail from Orange County and Hereford County. We may or may not be blood relatives, but I got a feeling we're plantation relatives. And so that's the way that's how our histories are intertwined. They are intertwined. And the Episcopal Church was landowners, plantation owners, right here in North Carolina. It was probably Episcopalians who owned my folk.
Most likely.
Most likely. Significant numbers of slaves before the Civil War were Episcopalian, baptized in the Episcopal Church. Now, they did what they had to do. As soon as the war was over, they left the Episcopal Church in droves. It's actually documented. That's documented history. The numbers dropped all of a sudden after the war. Now, was that against the Episcopal? No, it was against slavery. But our church had been complicit through landowners who owned people. So we have struggled with the same history of the nation. When Jim Crow happened, one of my predecessors here in North Carolina really did believe in the end of slavery as much as a Southern bishop could. I think he was a closet abolitionist. There's no I've read what the guy wrote. There's no question in my mind. As soon as the war was over, he worked to establish St. Augustine's College here in Raleigh. He saw to the establishment of at least one, and I think there was a second, multiracial congregations. This one was in Wilmington, North Carolina. And it was a congregation of former slaves and former slave owners. He saw the vision of reconciliation, of everybody being set free. Slave master and slave. Everybody said he saw it. I know this guy saw it. And when Jim Crow came, it had to die. And the congregations were forced to be separated. That was in the Episcopal Church. We parallel the history of the culture. You know, and you up to this present day. We sometimes stepped out ahead of it. And that's where we've been listening to the Lord. We've been listening to the Spirit when we have done that. And there have been, and that's been true in race sometimes. It's been true in LGBTQ people in the life of the church and society. We stepped out ahead. To some extent, was true around women's ordination to kind of a lesser degree. I think we were behind the curve on there, but there have been times when we've listened, as we say in liturgy, to what the Spirit has been saying to the churches and responded, and we've sometimes stepped out ahead.
Well, that brings me to my next question. So, as you know, the Diocese of Iowa, excuse me, approved a resolution on reparations this last fall. And when I somehow allowed myself to be the chair of it, I thought, well, this won't be that hard, because I lived in the East and I had lived through Washington and Maryland and all of the different places that had really made had been able to come up with a way of making reparations. And so it seemed simple, as I said, because I saw a way of doing it, and that was you go back and you study the history of your church, your diocese, and then you can use that to help you understand what needs to be done now. Because in the South and in the East, we have churches that have been there for 300 years, or at least there at the time of the enslavement. So they had a history to people in those churches could then kind of tie into that and see how, even though they themselves hadn't done the things that happened, they were in a line of people and an institution that had done these things. And so I think that helped make it easier in many ways to start that work of reparation. And in most of them, there was also some money that was added to it to help understand what had happened and to make things more equal. Well, here in Iowa, we don't have that kind of history.
Sure.
Iowa never had slavery, or at least it didn't have it as a state. And Iowa is all white. So in so many ways, people here have not seen the things that have gone on other places. And because they haven't seen them in their context, and I can say this, you don't know this, but my family, both my mother and father's side, came to Iowa, some in the 1850s, and then the others.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and some right before the Civil War, and some right after the Civil War. So we've been here a long, long time. Okay. Excuse me. But there were so few African Americans that our story is one that doesn't get told very often, and we didn't cause trouble. So even in the little town that my grandmother grew up in, they were the only Black people, but they were good people, because they were the only ones. So
yeah, when your numbers are small, it plays to be good. Yeah.
And that's kind of interesting, because her mother was white, her father was Black, so they were an interracial one in the 1870s, but they did it in. So Iowa has, I think, has this understanding that they don't have any problems because they don't have any Blacks. We do have more and more people coming in of color, and we also have had Indigenous people that we pushed out. But by pushing them out, it was easy to forget. So we get to 2021, and we're trying to do this thing around reparations. And we can't do it the way the other dioceses have done it. And we're really clear that part of what we have to do is we're going to try to go out 2 by 2 to every church in the diocese and start talking and having relationships. And I think that's the way to go, but that's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of time.
Yes.
And time is the right way to do it. But we also have the legislation right here that is doing things that are going to roll everything back. They want to roll back past Jim Crow. And where do we as churches stand on this? I have had, not people in my church, but other churches say that we shouldn't be getting involved in this. That's all political stuff. It's that social justice stuff. They want us just to talk about Jesus and what Jesus wanted. You can imagine my answer is, but I'd just like to hear what you think about the difference between these majority white places in the middle of our country who are going back and going back very quickly, and the way this WEGO goes our country. So how do we as a church step in?
Yeah, no, I've at executive council of the Episcopal Church in June. In June, I actually started talking about it a few months ago, but asked President Jennings and I have invited a group of people to help to start the legwork for, and I've called it Truth and Reconciliation, and stuck with that because what it means to repair the breach, which comes from the prophet Isaiah. I mean, it actually comes from the Bible, where God tells the prophet, you must be a repairer of the breach, which I think is helpful because repairing the breach isn't the same everywhere.
Right.
You see what I mean? And the Episcopal Church is we are a really diverse, trust me, we're diverse politically. Believe me, anytime I say something publicly, I get email. So trust me, I know how diverse we are. We really are. But we're also diverse culturally, and diverse in terms of those histories. And you just articulated it beautifully. In terms of Iowa, just head west and southwest, and they're different. So what it means to be repairers of the breach is to ask, what are the breaches that must be repaired? You see what I mean? What are the breaches that must be repaired? How do and to repair the breach is to overcome the separations, the divisions, the things that divide us, the things that diminish some and exalt others. Those are the breaches. And every human community has breaches. Some of them may be racial breaches in one place. Some of them may be something else in another. You know what I mean? But I guarantee you get 2 human beings, you're going to get a breach. It's just, you don't believe me, read the story of the Garden of Eden. Trust me. So how do we repair? What are the breaches and how do we participate in God's work of repairing the breach? And that's not going to be the same everywhere. So that's one thing that I would say, and I think your instincts and your description of Iowa is right on target. The other thing to be aware of, and I've become more aware of this as presiding bishop, is ways that I have, I don't necessarily mean Michael, but Michael as presiding bishop. Let me just work with Michael as presiding bishop. Have inherited benefit that I neither earned nor deserve, but I benefit from, if not the suffering of others, I don't want to make it too blank, but from historic wrongs that have led to my benefit now. Now, I don't know what that is in Iowa, but I guarantee you it's there because it's everywhere in the United States. I know it's everywhere in the United States. And when I talk to my friends in Great Britain, I mean, God, we're nothing compared. I mean, we all, anybody who's been part of any society that has been an empire of some way, shape, manner, or form, has benefited from others, and I don't want to, I mean, it's probably a little bit too strong to say the sufferings of others, but has benefited on the backs of others. We know that just as citizens of the United, as Westerners. I mean, need I say the vaccine for COVID-19? We've bought it all up off the market, which is part of the reason our brothers, sisters, and siblings in Africa have very little of it. I mean, that really is. Now, hopefully I heard some hopeful things out of our government and the G7 or G8 that they are going to be working on redistributing to get the vaccine. But the reality is we in the privileged nations bought it all up. And now, that's a breach. So how do we help to repair the breaches that are there? Some of it spawned by race. A lot of it spawned by race. It's not an accident. The poorer nations are the colored nations of the world. They're the nations of color. That's not. So how do we help to repair the breach that's maybe overseas in some respects, but in Iowa, you can participate in helping to repair those breaches as well as the ones at home?
Well, I think part of the problem is that part of what we might consider liberation actually is detrimental to others. And that's one of the problems in trying to just, to describe what real liberation is. For the European Americans, so they don't necessarily, some of them understand that they feel that they are liberated. So they don't see necessarily those who need to be also liberated. And we, again, just as Americans, you're right, do the same thing. I mean, I'm always careful to say, I understand that I'm very privileged in so many ways, but that doesn't take away those places which I'm not. But part of, especially coming out of COVID and all, is that people don't necessarily want to hear this right now.
Sure.
Been through so much, and it's like, it's like, can't we just get a breath? I have to back away from this. It's what a lot of people say. I just can't get involved. And this is the time that we need to be involved in all of these things, not just race, to erase this virus, all of those things. But after what we've gone through, how do we take our faith, I guess, and make sure that that's the thing that helps us to open up those gates that show us that there's no bridge over, there is this bridge. Or do we just stand behind the gate and pretend everything is fine?
Yeah, and Kim, I do think it's helpful to say, where are the breaches?
Mm-hmm.
Where are the breaches that are here? And they won't be like they are in Maryland. They're going to be like they are in whatever they are. And they may not be black and white.
Mm-hmm.
They may be indigenous.
Yes.
And Anglo or something. I mean, I'm talking off the top of my head. They may be class. There are poor people. There are more white poor people in America than there are black. Absolutely. Or brown. I mean, the reality is, where is there a breach? Where is a human being being diminished? A child of God. We're all children of God. And how can we help to repair the breach, which is the work of healing? I mean, again, keep reframing this in biblical terms. This is the work of healing. When Jesus was healing, Jesus did teaching, preaching, and healing. If you look in Matthew and Mark early on, those are the three things that he was doing. And that healing, all the healing was not just about medical things. It was about any human being that was being diminished by sickness, by mental illness, by political powers, anything that diminished a child of God. That's where you see Jesus healing. So anything that diminishes a human child of God, we've got to be participants in that healing, of healing the breaches. So how can we as Christians who follow Jesus, because I'm into Jesus, I mean, who are following Jesus, follow in his footsteps for real. Let's be healers. How can we be? We're wounded healers, like Henry Nouwen taught us. But how can we be healers in our communities? Healers that has to do with socioeconomic conditions, as well as healers that have to do with our mental, spiritual, and physical selves. How can we extend the healing ministry of the church into the social context in which we live? And that is to take Jesus seriously. I think that brings more people on board, not on a political agenda, but on where is healing needed. And it may sometimes be in legislation that diminishes anyone. We can't do that. You said we've got to say, no, that's not right. Everybody's a child of God, and and so sometimes you got to get into the legislative fray, but do it on the grounds of what we believe and trust Jesus is leading us to.
Well, and that's
I think sorry, Kim, for jumping in.
Oh,
Sorry. Yeah, but it's a threefold L God. We have to get to life-giving at some point. But there is an additional question in the chat.
Yes, sorry, and I didn't.
Came from one of our guests from South Sudan, Bishop David Kier is here from zooming in from South Sudan.
Oh, wonderful.
He's Bishop. I'm probably not got the right pronunciation of your diocese, but Panring is how it looks to me. One of the deacons, Deacon Deborah, came to settle in Iowa at one point a couple of years ago, and Bishop David is I think is her bishop and has come on to be with us. And he asked the question related to all of this also, how do you work with the idea of forgiveness? How do I deal with the question of forgiveness in a country that's torn apart by the civil war like South Sudan? So I just had that question in, and before we move on, we have to move on to the next segment on life giving. But I just wondered if you had a few words to say to Bishop David.
Oh, well, welcome, Bishop David. Wow, what a blessing to be with you. Far be it from me to have any words of wisdom there, but I do think Jesus does. When Jesus forgave his enemies on the cross, I assume he was talking to the Roman soldiers who, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, and anybody else who was complicit in killing him and having him killed. But he didn't back away from what he stood for. He didn't say, you know what? I've changed my mind. You're forgiven. I've changed my mind. Let me down from the cross. And I'm not going to keep saying blessed are the poor and the poor in spirit. I'm not going to keep teaching about love, or I'm not going to keep, you see what I mean? He didn't say, no, I'm going to stop doing what I was doing. He forgave them and let them see him stand for love, even as he died. I think that, and I'm not sure that I can always live up to that model of actually working for what ought to be a world where forgiveness rules and where love rules, and at the same time doing it with people who are hurting me. It's hard. And yet, I really believe that's what Jesus calls us, Michael, to do. And that's our witness. Our witness isn't just to be right. In the Episcopal Church, we talk about justice. You hear the word justice, justice, justice. Justice must be done. But justice isn't the only virtue that God wishes. God ultimately wants reconciliation. And I'll never forget a sermon I heard where the preacher said, justice must be done, but justice is not enough. Ultimately, we must work to a beloved community where those who have committed injustice and those who have suffered from it can find a way to be brothers, sisters, siblings, the people of God, the beloved community. And that's what I see of Jesus on the cross, even forgiving those who have killed him.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kim. And thank you for, I hope people are becoming more conscious of the work, the heavy work that we have before us as a diocese, as you chair that task force and move us forward.
Yeah. Thank you for doing it.
Yeah, it's a great job.
Thank you, Iowa, for doing it. It's not easy. And you know what? There are no quick answers.
Mm.
There aren't. It's okay to take your time and to do it the Iowa way. Because if you do it another way, that's not your way. You know, take your time, love everybody into it, love them into it. And you may create a model for the rest of us that'll help us. So thank you.
So the final section of this conversation is really to deal with the issue of God as life-giving, especially as it relates to the care of creation. And so I hand over to Jen Latham, who has formerly a priest of this diocese, has recently has moved to Hawaii. I don't know why, but she has headed up a lot of our work on care of creation, and so I invite her to speak now.
Hi, I'm Jen Latham, and I'm a priest in the Diocese of Hawaii, and I was formed and ordained a priest in the Diocese of Iowa. And I'm here to tell you about God's life-giving presence that I feel and experience out here in the natural world. I've lived many places in my life. I grew up on the East Coast and moved to the West for graduate school. And then I lived in New York and in China and in the Midwest. And in all of these places, the farm, the mountains, the desert, the cities, the small towns, the prairies, in all of these places, I have experienced God's life-giving presence through the natural world. God's presence is here so abundantly in these places where different ecosystems exist. And in each of the places where I've lived, I've explored those different systems. I've explored those different wild places, and I've felt God's presence there. In fact, those are the places where I have felt closest and most present with God. Each of these places offers so many metaphors for God's presence, for God in the world, whether it's looking at those ecosystems and how the different parts of those systems, the plants, the animals, the land, interact with one another, or whether it's the beautiful scenes we get in each of those places. But it is in each of those places that I have felt God's presence. God's loving presence, God's life-giving presence. And I would imagine that some of you too might feel that, might feel God's presence when you see the sun shining through the clouds, or when you see animals in their natural habitats, or when you see a beautiful vista from a mountaintop. And so that's one of the reasons why I feel called to care for God in creation, through God's creation. I feel motivated and excited to share my love for God through work in the generative world, in this world where nature and humans meet. We are part of God's creation, and we are part of God's ecosystem here. And so part of our work in the world is to understand our place, understand how best we are to live in this place in conjunction with, in harmony with those things that are around us, those creatures that God has made, that we share this planet with. This is one of those places where my family and I retreated to during the pandemic, and it offered us comfort during very difficult times. So thank you for letting me share my story with you, and I hope that you have a chance to experience God in the wild places too. Aloha, and thank you.
Thank you, Jen. So our final moderator is State Senator Rob Hogue, who is at Christ Church in Cedar Rapids. And he has, he is, the time has been were you the minority leader, or what were you in the Senate? Just something like that. But he's a leading Democrat within the state. And so you think that we need prayers, Bishop Curry?
Yeah.
He needs double prayers.
Yeah.
He has not that I'm trying to be partisan here, but I just we do have some issues in our work here in Iowa, to putting our gospel values forward. But Rob is one who himself also works out of that sense of his love of Christ in putting forward the work he does in politics. So Rob, I know a special concern of yours is the care of creation. So I'll hand this portion over to you.
Great. Thank you, Bishop Scarf and Bishop Curry. It's great to have you with us in Iowa today.
Thank
I
you.
am Rob Hogue. I'm a member of Christ Episcopal Church, and this is an honor. I want to pick up where we left the last discussion off. We just saw a great video from Jen Latham.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm one of those people who is inspired and feel connected to God in the natural world. But just like there's been and continues to be injustice in race relations, there has been and continues to be injustice in a relationship with the natural world. In Iowa, this year we're having a terrible drought. Less than a year ago, we had a terrible windstorm that destroyed over 25% of our trees in the state, a derecho. We've had major floods in 2019, 2016, 2011, 2008. And of course, we continue to have natural areas destroyed, biodiversity loss in our state. And as many Iowans know, before you go to the beach in this state, you better check to see if there's an advisory on whether the water is safe to be in. And then that's in Iowa, but then you look around the world, and we all see what's happening around the world right now with the floods and the droughts and the extreme storms and the heat wave in the Pacific Northwest, and then deeper than that, the damage to indigenous lands, the toxics in our infrastructure, the extinctions of species. Okay, and then I'm going to take you one more step of injustice, Presiding Bishop Curry. I like to say that no one is so rich that he or she is immune from the consequences of climate change and the ecological crisis.
Yes.
But we know that poor and vulnerable communities are at much greater, are experiencing more harm and are much greater risk. You know, you look at it, the derecho last year, it damaged my house, but I owned a house, I had insurance.
Right.
It also wiped out apartment buildings with poor tenants who did not have insurance.
Yeah.
Tornadoes, like mobile home parks, they are particularly destructive of low cost housing. we know that there's environmental pollution disproportionately in poor and marginalized communities. And even the heat waves in Northwest this year, greater impact and death in low-income neighborhoods. So what, in the face of all this destruction and loss, how can people of faith be life-giving? And what should churches be doing about it?
Rob, thank you. Thank you for that question, but thank you for being an advocate in the legislative process, and that's not easy. But remember, no. But there's a good word in the New Testament. Jesus used the word advocate to describe the work of the Holy Spirit in John's Gospel, the Paraclete, the advocate. So you are a representative of the great advocate. So thank you. So it's hard, but please keep on. God knows we need you. This is really hard because, and I say it's really hard in part because there's not a national will yet to do what we have to do to at least we may not reverse climate change, but we can halt it. We can profoundly retard it and halt it so it doesn't get worse, because it can get worse. We don't have a national will yet to do that. And so one thing, I mean, it doesn't sound like it's much, is people have to keep advocating. The climate's not on the national agenda in the same way. And we've got so much, there's so much, I know, but it's not on the national and state. It's not on the agendas in a significant way quite yet. And so we have to keep advocating to get issues of climate, issues of the environment, issues wherever they surface, keep advocating in state legislatures, on the federal level, and on local levels. I mean, so I think the work of advocacy on every conceivable level is really critical, because that sometimes there's a passage, and I don't mean to get biblical, but well, it's what I do for a living. But in Ezekiel, when God calls Ezekiel and says, "I need you to prophesy," and the Spirit says to Ezekiel, whether the people hear or refuse to hear, they will know that there has been a prophet in their midst. That the work of prophecy and advocacy is to keep coming back to the truth, even when it won't be heard. I'm just moved, and I can't remember her name, but the Democratic Congresswoman who for years has advocated for a tax credit for child care that was significant and substantive enough that it could actually, I've heard Marian Wright Edelman from the Children's Defense Fund talk about this, just that could dramatically reduce child poverty in this country. And I can't remember her name, but she's one of the East Coast districts. She has been advocating for this for 15 years or something like that, and it finally just happened. And it's gonna, now hopefully it will continue, but it's gonna happen. Advocates for the environment and for environmental impact and mitigation and all of the work on every level we need to do, and church folk can do this. This is as biblical can get. Just to give you all some quick text, Genesis chapter 1 is about the creation. It's not ours, it's God's, and we have a responsibility to care for it. That's in the Bible. That's in the Bible. And if that's not enough, John 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his only son. The word for world is cosmos, which means everything. God didn't just come for the good of humanity. Jesus didn't come just for us. He came for the creation, for the whole world. We have a responsibility to care for God's world, to love God's world just as much as God loves the world. So this is not ancillary to our Christian thing. We've got to move it to the center as much as possible and advocate for that. And that's where we actually may have some agreement with our more conservative religious friends, even some who may be fundamentalistic, who we might not agree with on virtually anything else. I mean, I remember one day going to a congressman here in North Carolina, and the Roman Catholic bishop and I were agreeing, and the Southern Baptist Convention in this state agreed. It was on some immigration stuff. And I remember going to him and saying, look, anytime you hear the Episcopalians and the Roman Catholics and the Southern Baptist Convention, we're agreeing, brother, you need to pay attention to that. Trust me, because we don't agree on much else. But if we're agreeing on that, pay attention. I think on care of this creation and the environment and advocating for it, I think we actually may have some ecumenical coalitions that are bigger than the usual suspects if we will mobilize them. That's my guess. Advocacy. The second thing is, and I know you all have done this, and this is a little thing in one sense, but it's not. What can we do in our local communities ourselves, in our churches and our local communities, and groups like Interfaith Power and Light that help churches and people, homes and families do the kind of work that helps to reduce our own footprint. It's not a big thing, I know, but it's a little something we can do. So do it, advocate, do something about our own footprint. And then anytime there is something we can do it. You know what I mean? There are groups that are actually out there working. Join up with them. Do something. Don't give up. Who was it said the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good folk to do nothing? Well, do something. If everybody does something, we might generate enough positive energy, if I can use it, that it moves to the national agenda, to the global agenda, and something bigger begins to happen. That's my hope and dream, but it's a tough one.
Well, Bishop Curry, I'd just like to share with you something I came across this week. Right now in the United Kingdom, there's a Young Christians Climate Network that is literally on the road to Glasgow. Glasgow is the next international negotiations. They're walking 1,000 miles in 100 days from Canterbury to Glasgow. And that's something I wanted to lift up to you. I know the National Episcopal Church is looking for people to serve as delegates to the Glasgow Summit,
right?
Which is great. But there are so many solutions that work if we could come together and do them. And we can do that, as you say, as our churches through Interfaith Power and Light. We have a great chapter here in Iowa Interfaith Power and Light, specifically focused on trying to lift up farm leadership on climate change, which is phenomenal. I just want to raise that up, encourage people to get on the road to Glasgow.
Yes.
You can literally be on the road or be there. This is an important moment in the world on climate change. I want to finish with something I've said in the past, which is when you talk, last night you preached on factions in the church in Paul's letter. And today you talked about John Lewis and the person who wanted to meet with John Lewis because he had changed. I've said about climate change, a doubting Thomas today can be a leader for climate action tomorrow.
Yes.
And I'd like you to sort of talk about what we can do with the people who don't see the destruction and the loss that are happening in the world. And let me tell you, many Iowans are experiencing it. Some people still don't see it or don't connect it. And then others might think, and you've alluded to this, that Christianity doesn't really have a role on it.
Right.
How would you invite those members of our churches or people in the public to get more involved with us on addressing life-giving care for creation?
I think we've got to bring this into the center of our Christian proclamation, teaching, and our life together. In other words, everybody's got to experience it in their parish, their local parish or mission context. And for example, to actually make sure that in our in worship, use worship and Christian education, that in worship that we're making use of opportunities to lift up the creation and care for the creation in our life. We, have there's a stewardship of creation, and there's liturgical text. There's sermon outlines that clergy can use. There's Christian education resource material. It's like in late September, early October, that was been developed ecumenically. But there's some old stuff. Rogation days. Rogation days are deeply part of the Anglican. They go back. I mean, they're even before Anglicanism. They go back to Christianity in the early days around the harvest and the planting in the city. So why not observe Rogation days again, as well as observing Earth Day? But Rogation days are in the prayer book. They've been there for years. Days when we give thanks for the harvest. Turn Thanksgiving instead of just a Turkey Day, which I love. I mean, I have to admit, I love turkey, but actually turn Thanksgiving into, in other cultures, I know in the West Indies, for example, they have harvest days where they give thanks for the harvest. That's what Thanksgiving's about. So why not turn it into, you see what I'm saying, around the environment? Let those become both teaching moments in the church. See what I mean? We've already got some things if we would develop them and use them. And there are resources, especially around stewardship of creation. There should be a bunch of them on the, Meg will know, on the Episcopal Church website. They're there, and Meg will know whether there are resources. People don't have to make it a part. Make care for the environment an ongoing part of the life of the church, so that it's actually, this is just what we do. It's a normal part of what we do. We've done this in the Episcopal Church before. Stewardship was something we didn't do well 50 years ago. That actually has changed. Now, we're not perfect, but it's kind of normal. People expect stewardship as part of what it means to be, it's part of what it means. So what would happen if care of creation and our role in that as stewards of this creation, it becomes a normal part? I've said we trying to do the same thing with evangelism. And at this point, we're getting a little bit better in the Episcopal Church. People aren't giggling as much when you talk about evangelism, or when I first started talking about doing revivals around the church, I knew people were giggling and saying, Episcopalians don't do revivals and all that kind of. But now I can't keep up with the request to do them. Which is, the point is, move care of creation practically and globally from the periphery to the center. Move it to where Jesus is, because even the hairs of your head are numbered. The birds of the air. Does he not care for you as much as he cares for them, if not more? The Jesus who talked about mustard seeds. The Jesus who most of his parables were about the land, about vegetation, about bearing fruit. The Jesus who read a Bible where Psalm 24 says, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. It's right there. All we have to do is raise it up. We don't have to make it up. Just raise it up. And I think we can do that liturgically. Anyway, in education, I really do. And that's exciting, because that's actually can be interesting. And, I think there's more of a hearing, because storms and dislocations of weather are becoming more and more something that I've noticed. I've tried to go to dioceses when there've been major traumatic events, and it's hard to keep up. It has been hard to keep up. I mean, I've been to wildfires and the hurricanes. I mean, I'm dreading hurricane season. The hurricanes, the wildfires, the droughts. I mean, it's all over. We're actually experiencing it here in the West now. We weren't 20 years ago. in the same way that I think we are now, so that I think there's more of a hearing, but bring it to into the center of the life of the church. If Episcopalians do it in church on Sunday, they'll pay attention and think about it Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank
Rob.
you, Rob, and thank you for what you do.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you to Kim and to Charles and to Greta, and testimonies from Jen and from Meg and Tom. And thank you, Presiding Bishop, for your availability to us for today. It's been a wonderful, wonderful morning. So where do we go from here? Well, the immediate thing that happens, of course, is, believe it or not, we gather again, this time in person, this time next week. And we're going to be electing our 10th bishop. So between now and then, this revival was not planned to be within that segment of time, but that's how God intended it. And so we have come together this weekend to prepare ourselves for next weekend in many, many ways. And to keep that link going, every night at 8 p.m., there will be a compline each night at 8 p.m. leading to the electing convention, led by different churches or different individuals, a sort of novena of prayer as we come forward to that election next Saturday. But the other things too that we want to do, because we moved the whole election process back a bit, I ended up having to chair another convention in October. I would have been retired apart from that, but so, it's Love Ignites is going to be the title. I've run out of creativity, so Love Ignites will be the theme. So how are we going to see God's love at work? And I just want to pick up on that. Move it to where Jesus is what the presiding bishop just said. Move it to where Jesus is, because it's not only the hairs of our heads are numbered, the hairs of everyone's head is numbered by God. And so, what we want to do is encourage in action to sort of go and have a neighborhood prayer walk. There's details about it will be in the website, and it's already there for Meg has given it to us in the chat. Not just walking around to see what's going on. It's not just walking and praying, but it's discerning how God is already calling you or is present in the neighborhood around us. We're suggesting you get together in groups, maybe 2s or 3s from your parish, from your congregation, and maybe on a Tuesday night at 5. I don't know what time it might be, but something intentional where you just take a walk and see who and where is God at work, and with whom is God at work around your parish, maybe in your shopping centers, in your dog parks, in your town squares, in your community gardens, a sort of 5-block radius of the church. Look around, pray, care, ask in silence, listen. Avoid chatting and focusing with each other, but just listen and then bring it into the church and see what God is calling you to do. There's a lot of guidance that can be offered to this. Don't want to take up much time about it, but I'm inviting you and challenging you to take with the initiative and the sort of building up of our spirit that God has come through this revival and this engagement with the presiding bishop, and to take this out so that we can, when we come together in October, we can give witness to the things that we are observing, and we pass that witness on into the shared leadership of the 10th bishop. So these things all kind of come together. And so thank you. Last night was absolutely remarkable, the way things fit together. Meg, thank you once more for everything that you did to make all this possible. We can't even imagine whether you ever sleep or not, but we assume you don't, but it's been great. Presiding Bishop, thank you so much for your presence among us. I got an email today asking if I had any pull over at the Field of Dreams, and could I get tickets for the August 12th game? And it was a little bit bittersweet, really, because we had intended to have you able to come out on the stage at that stadium and ask the important question that we all know the answer to. Is this heaven? No, it's Iowa. You know, we live it, and so we kind of used to it. But we wanted you to, if you would pray us out with a blessing, I'd invite you to do that now, please.
Sure. Bishop, thank you again, and thank you to everyone, and to Rob and Greta and Charles and Kim, and Megan, the whole team, and to you, my friend Bishop Allen, and to Donna. I see Donna. I always see Donna signing. To everyone, thank you for letting me share some time with you. Now go forth into the world in peace. Be strong and of good courage. Hold fast to that which is good. Render to no one evil for evil, but love the Lord your God, love your neighbor, and love yourself. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be on you and remain with you in this world in which we live this day and forevermore. Amen.